We are at the Mental Health in the Church Conference at Bay Presbyterian Church in Bay Village, Ohio. This event sponsored by Key Ministry. Glad to have you with us in person and online. And our next session, we're going to be seeing how Key Ministry has developed a model for mental health ministry that churches can apply, ministries can apply. It's very important for us to learn how to do this so we can be effective in this area of ministry. And taking us through that from Key Ministry, Catherine Boyle and Dr. Steve Grcevich.
Well, thanks to all of you guys for sticking around for the end of the conference and for joining us this morning. What I'd like to focus on, during our time together, when I spoke yesterday, I shared with everybody this slide. And that part of the reason why we do what we do as a ministry is the recognition that families impacted by disabilities, especially mental health disabilities, are significantly less likely to be part of a local church. And so we had shared this, we had shared this in the main session yesterday morning, that when a family has a child with autism, statistically, the likelihood that they'll set foot in a church goes down by 84%. It's 73% when families have a child with depression, 55% when they have a child with a disruptive behavior disorder, 45% when they have a child with an anxiety disorder, and around 20% for ADD and ADHD. And most of those kids, and families impacted with autism, it's the comorbid mental health conditions that co-occur or coexist with the autism that are oftentimes keeping them out of church. And we had talked about this issue as well with adults, that when you go back and you look at the Baylor study of religion, if you look at adults experiencing symptoms of anxiety or depression, on any given Sunday, it's about 50 to 60% less likely compared to their peers that they're going to be at church. And so, it's one thing to talk about this, but one of the things that Catherine and I, that we've tried to contribute to the mental health ministry movement, is how do churches think about this in a way that they can develop a strategy, to overcome some of these challenges and some of these barriers to church attendance. And so, so when you look at that data, the question comes up, well, why is this so hard for folks? And part of what we've conceptualized this is through the cultural model of disability, so that there are certain traits that are associated with common mental health conditions that oftentimes clash with church culture. And when I talk about church culture in this context, we're talking about our expectations for how people should and will act and interact when we gather together for worship, when we gather together to serve, when we gather together, to experience community or for Christian education. And so when we start thinking about, well, what are the barriers that we need to craft a strategy to overcome that are connected to or tied into church culture? In our inclusion model, there are 7 barriers specifically that we identified. The first is stigma. The second is anxiety. The third is one's capacity for self-control. The fourth is sensory processing. The fifth is social communication. The sixth is social isolation. And the seventh is past church experience. And so, as we think about what it looks like to develop an inclusion strategy, what I think is important and what we want people to take away is that we're not asking any church to start a new program. We're talking about creating a mindset as opposed to establishing a program. And when we train churches, part of what we're hoping to do is that we want them to develop a way of thinking about, how do we include folks in all of the stuff that our church sees as important in building disciples? And so how do we include people in all of the stuff that we're already doing as a church, that we find that works. And part of why this is important, and it's very different in terms of mental health ministry versus what we do with churches regarding disability or special needs ministry, is that families who are impacted by mental illness, the last thing they want to do is to be part of some sort of ministry that calls attention to them as being different. The kids that I talk to and the folks I work with in my practice, they want to fit in and they want to do what everybody else is doing, and they will flee anything that calls attention to them, as being different. So as Catherine and I talk about this process, the idea here is that we want church leaders who are, here present today or watching online to think about some of the things that we're going to be sharing in the little model that we use for including folks in all of the stuff that you're already doing to make disciples and to help people grow.
So we have developed an acronym that hopefully will be easy for everyone to remember, and that is teacher. And so over the next few minutes, we'll be talking about each of these letters and how these things are things that you can evaluate within the context of your own church. So T is team, environments, activities, communication, help, education, and responsibility. And just quickly, we have a QR code at the end of the slides, so feel free to take pictures of the individual slides, but also we'll have the whole thing available for you if you want to take a picture of the QR code. So the first one is T. Who needs to be on the inclusion team? So you might think, well, maybe that's the jurisdiction of the disability ministry. Yeah, well, maybe, but as Steve just mentioned, this is not a ministry that is over in a wing of your building somewhere. This is more of an overall approach. So as a result, we would strongly encourage that this would be something that every significant area of your church leadership would have a seat at the table. So, go back. Sorry, hang on a second. Okay, so some of the people that might be at that kind of discussion about mental health ministry at your church, absolutely senior leadership, because typically no significant changes, no significant really increases in understanding of certain issues that families are facing in your church are going to be addressed thoroughly without buy-in from senior leadership. Ministry directors who are church-wide, from all of the KidMin leadership to the hospitality team, the individuals who work with people who come in literally off the street needing, benevolent type support, anybody who has a significant ministry leader role. So, and then when you think about your own, let's just use children's ministry for an example, within the KidMin organization, there's maybe different departments, there's different age groups. So all of those people who have leadership responsibility, whether they're a staff person or just a strongly committed volunteer, lay leader person, all of those people need to have some level of understanding, some level of perhaps training, and just awareness that this is an approach and a support structure that we are going to offer to children and teens and adults who come to our church. And I really encourage you, there may be people who are in your church, maybe who are mental health ministry or mental health professionals or have lived experience with mental health issues themselves or their family members. They can be just a wealth of information to help guide this kind of initiative within your church. So even if they're not somebody who's already in one of these roles, just definitely consider including that sort of individual in this kind of approach.
Yeah, a couple quick comments on this. That the senior leader, especially in a very large church, doesn't necessarily need to be on the team, but they have to have explicitly endorsed the process. Yeah. Because nothing's going anywhere in a church of any size if the senior pastor doesn't sign off on it. The other thing that's important here is to have representatives from all the major areas or departments of ministry in the church, because inherently mental health ministry is family ministry. So that if one member of the family is unable to attend, You know, I tell people I don't have a whole lot of 9-year-olds in my practice who drive themselves to church. You know, so if mom or dad have an issue, the folks involved with, adult ministry, men's ministry, women's ministry, worship ministries, need to be, involved with that to make sure that there are environments that are welcoming to the other members of the family as well, because it can be anyone. Whereas a lot of places do disability ministry specifically focused on kids, we have to think about the entire family when we're looking at mental health stuff, because as I learned about 30 minutes into child psychiatry school, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and that parents who have issues oftentimes have kids with issues. And so speaking of environments, the physical spaces where ministry take place can have a profound effect. Like, if you were here earlier, like listening to Daniel Rosati, like earlier in the day, when he was talking about like, some of the struggles that he has attending church, like when the worship music gets too loud. One of the things that we know is that folks who have mental health concerns, many of these common mental health conditions involve differences with sensory processing. Where either, the level of sensory stimulation, can be overwhelming for some people, yet there are others, who find, bright lights, loud music, particularly engaging. So that we want to think about this in a way, in terms of, how do we make all of our environments more welcoming? The other thing that's an important concern in thinking about this is that environment, for people who have conditions that impact their executive functioning, one's capacity for self-control, setting priorities, delaying gratification, managing time. When folks have a condition that negatively impacts their executive functioning, the more environmental inputs they have to process in the moment, the less cognitive capacity they have for focusing on those things that are most important. And so, when we think about like creating spaces where, and actually we're going to show you a slide to illustrate this. And some of you were actually in this space, as part of the conference. At the time, one of our previous middle school ministry directors were here. We talked about like how can they design a space, to help middle school kids get the takeaways that they needed from their worship activities. And so, if you have, with 1 in 9 folks having ADHD, how do you create physical spaces that help to promote focus and attention? How do we help attendees prioritize things that are most important in our spaces? One of the things that folks don't think about a lot, is that people who have mental health challenges oftentimes have issues with memory and processing sequential directions. So that signage in a church, especially for newcomers who are unfamiliar with where they're going, is something that can be particularly important, or particularly important for people maybe who are self-conscious or wrestling with a lot of anxiety, where they're uncomfortable approaching unfamiliar people to go ahead and ask for directions.
So the A is for activities, and we encourage churches to focus on what are those things that are really most important for spiritual growth in your church, in your existing ministry. So a lot of churches have a path towards not only understanding what Jesus did for us, but also spiritual formation. And so as an example, if memorizing scripture is an important element of that, well, make sure that whatever mental health inclusion practices you're offering are going to be focused on that, versus making sure that all the kids are sitting still during the time that maybe Bible reading is going on. it is very important to cut through kind of the clutter of the classroom and the things that maybe are not as consequential to that person having a relationship with Jesus. So we have some tools on our website. We have several called There's This Kid, and they actually give like real life classroom scenarios for children and give you some strategies and approaches that can help support the executive functioning needs of the kids that have these mental health challenges. Turns out that scripture memorization is one of those things that actually is really helpful for strengthening executive functioning in all of us. So I encourage you to visit the Key Ministry website to see some of those. But, so what are those things that, you're most are most impactful in the ministries and most focused on, raising up disciples? Those are the kinds of things that we strongly encourage churches to focus on, whether it's in the classroom, in a small group type environment, in a worship kind of setting, and then also on evangelism and outreach kinds of opportunities.
Yeah, so on occasion, like when we get invited different places and when we're meeting with church leadership teams, like one of the first questions that I ask, like when I get in the door is, well, what's your discipleship strategy? Because whatever it is that your church focuses on to help people grow spiritually is where we need to put the emphasis in your inclusion strategy. So that, if your expectation is that people learn by being a part of a small group, then that means that we need to be doing, significant training with your small group leaders, to help them to understand, for example, again, you think about people with anxiety. And that folks with anxiety, their brains are essentially hardwired to overestimate the level of risk entering into a new or an unfamiliar situation. And so that, think about what it's like for a person like that, when they come to a church and they learn that they're expected to be part of a small group where they start disclosing and talking about all kinds of personal things in front of unfamiliar people. So how do you train your small group leaders to help facilitate that? Like one of the advantages, like let's say that you're a church and you have a phenomenal lead pastor, and the way that people grow is by coming to worship and learning from the teaching on Sunday morning. Then we need to start thinking about, well, what is it that your assimilation team and that your welcome team can do to make that as positive experience as possible for someone coming to the church. And one of our little exercises, for example, that we use sometimes is that, we use the example that, let's say there's a family down the street from your church. Single mom, 9-year-old son, 6-year-old daughter. The 9-year-old son gets invited to VBS, loves it, wants to come to church every Sunday. He has ADHD and dyslexia. His mom has panic disorder and social anxiety, and his 6-year-old sister has separation anxiety. Let's think about everything that could possibly go wrong for that family the first time they come to a worship service. So it's understanding, like, whatever it is, be it being a part of a worship service, if you're looking to include people in like outwardly focused service activities, and if that's how they grow, we have to have activities available for folks who, again, process the world differently. Now, the fourth letter in the whole teacher thing has to do with communication. And this is an area where I think that the scope of what churches can do is most expansive. It's also kind of low-hanging fruit in that I think that this is one of the most impactful things churches can do in terms of helping their own people to be able to share their stories with one another, and also changing perceptions that exist in the larger community. So that one of the things, there was a study, it's a little over 10 years old now, that Lifeway Research had done, specifically on the topic of mental illness in the church. And one of the cohorts that they interviewed for part of this study were adult family members of adults with serious mental illness. And so when they interviewed those families and they asked them, what's the one thing you would most like your church to do that would be of help, help to you and your family? It was for their pastors to talk about mental health related issues during worship services. And while they updated this about 2 years ago, and it's not quite as dire as the statistics appear that I'm presenting up here, where, again, in most churches, this is not something that they ever talk about. The reason why this makes such a big difference is that by the pastor being willing, to talk about it in large group settings, the stigma about mental illness, as we've discussed the last 2 days in the church, is probably worse than it is, in the larger population. That there was this study also as part of the Lifeway research study where they had found that 55% of unchurched adults believe that folks with mental health issues aren't welcome at church. Doing what we can to change those outside perceptions becomes really important. As well as, simply, broaching the topic and having senior leadership talk about it in worship services becomes very, very powerful. So that it doesn't even need to be an entire sermon. That there was a few years ago that we were consulting with a very large, well-known church, senior pastor wasn't part of the work that we were doing with 250 volunteers there on a Saturday morning. But it was interesting. So, as part of our assessment and working with them, I went to their worship service, the following Sunday. And, the pastor comes out, I'd like to welcome you to blah, blah, blah church. I'd like to start off this morning by praying for anyone who's with us who might be struggling with depression. Boom. Something as simple as that, communicates to the folks of the church that this is something that's safe to talk about in, the context of your small groups or your relationships. One of our churches that's well represented here, there are a number of folks here from Cuyahoga Valley Church. And I know that they won an award a few years ago from our local NAMI group for, the work that they had done in terms of cultural awareness. One of the things, understanding that, that there are many people who have mental health struggles who stop going to church as a result of this, or, as a way of changing this widespread belief that people aren't welcome at church. The guy who was the founding pastor of the church made a Facebook video specifically for their folks to share. Hi, my name's Rick Duncan. I'm the founding pastor of Cuyahoga Valley Church, and I explicitly want to welcome, anyone to our church who may be struggling with mental health issues. We know what this is like. My father was a pastor. He struggled with depression. Something as simple as that the church can put out through their social media for attendees at the church to be able to share with their friends and neighbors who don't have a church, is hugely impactful. Some of the other things, so we touched on a couple of these things. One of the other issues that I think, is important to consider, that people in particular with anxiety, with modern technology, are going to be, they're going to be watching online services, and they go to church websites before they ever, physically, set foot or visit a new church. And one of the ways that we can positively use technology is, again, people with anxiety overestimate risk entering into new and unfamiliar situations. So if we want people to do something new or different, show them as much video as you can of what they're going to experience in a new environment. So that, I have kids in my practice where maybe they go to church every Sunday, but the idea of going on the middle school or the high school retreat for 2 or 3 days at a campsite at an unfamiliar place is overwhelming. So the advice that I'm giving the middle school and the high school ministry guys is, when you're doing something new or different, take as many pictures as you can and shoot as much video of that as you can and put it up on your website and your various platforms. You know, the mom I talked about a couple of minutes ago, like the single mom with the 9-year-old son with ADHD and her 6-year-old with separation anxiety, she's going to be all over your website because she doesn't want to stand out if she comes and visits your church. She's going to want to be able to see, you know, how are people dressed? What can I expect? And so, you know, so that, you know, when we think about like using a communication strategy, you know, it's also applying these kinds of technology in a way that folks who may be looking for a church are able to overcome their anxieties, you know, and based upon what they see on our website and on our various platforms, it helps to prepare them and to relieve anxiety, particularly about new or unfamiliar experiences.
So the next letter is H. Now, church knows how to do help, right? I mean, we are an army of volunteers who show up with the casseroles. So people who have mental health challenges, you know, particularly families that have kids or other family members who have really significant challenges that result in hospitalizations, they have a lot of those same kinds of needs that the person in your church who has cancer needs. So what are some of those heartfelt needs? So it might be something like, the casserole brigade. It might be taking your kids, you know, the kids of the family whose mom is in the hospital because of a mental health crisis, you know, making sure that those kids can get back and forth from band practice or sports practice. It might be babysitting when a parent needs to go to a therapy appointment or take a child to a mental health appointment. Other things that can be done within the context of church that are specific to mental health needs that may not exist in your church right now, but is some of the things that we've talked about throughout this conference, such as, have referrals available to culturally competent professionals in your area and treatment facilities. Get to know those professionals who are in your church and in your community so you can be confident that when you send them to those individuals that they're going to get appropriate care for their needs. I mentioned the whole casserole thing, but just being a friend who will come alongside and love and support your family in the time of crisis and then ongoing. Kelly spoke about that very eloquently this morning in our earlier session, but that can just mean the world for a family who feels like nobody really cares about their challenge because it's not something that's talked about on a typical Sunday morning. Just that ministry of presence anybody can give, and it can be quite impactful.
Yeah, a couple of other things that I would sort of touch on when it comes to, looking at sort of practical ways of offering care and support. Daniel Rosati talked about one earlier this morning where Daniel likes to volunteer, for the children and youth ministry at his church, but Daniel's got a disability. He's on a fixed income. He can't drive. Something as simple as someone being able to give him a ride to and from church every Sunday would make a profound difference. Our church here, Beth Golick from our team, is the disability engagement director. And one of the most powerful things that our church does here is serving the community is offering respite care for parents who have kids with disabilities, including mental health disabilities. And when you see like 100 or 150 people from the church are giving up their Friday night to be part of that. And I know that families are desperate for this, that when Beth opens online registration, for the respite nights here at the church, it fills within an hour. Families are hungry. It meets a profound need. And we know from when we were involved in doing this in the earlier days of our ministry, families who come to a church to take advantage of that kind of respite care are significantly more likely within the next 12 months to end up at a weekend worship service. Other things, and I guess now we're kind of getting into sort of the category, the category of education. And one of the great things about our time together over the last couple of days is I think that everybody who's been here, is more aware of just the breadth and scope of the resources that are available, for churches who want to learn more. So there's the issue of like, well, what kind of training do pastors or church, staff need, in understanding how to better serve folks with these struggles? What kind of training will help them to respond better when individuals from the church approach them in some sort of a mental health crisis? So some of the things that we see more and more churches doing is, the sanctuary course, which is a congregational, it's a course for congregations to help entire churches, attendees as well as church staff, better understand the needs and issues that folks have related to mental illness. It might be mental health first aid, responding to folks in crisis. The American Bible Society folks, have been sharing here the last couple of days. It's becoming more trauma informed about, helping people who are coming to church who are broken and have, had significant hurts and significant disruptions in their life. It can be something as simple as, churches, as they come to know different, mental health professionals, counselors, resources, having evenings, for their congregation and invite friends and neighbors to build awareness, which is something that I've often been asked to do at churches around here in the area. When your student ministries, having an evening to, educate families about like the mental health challenges that teens are experiencing. It's like hanging a welcome sign out in front of your church to other families that if this is an area of struggle for them, that they're likely to be welcome.
So whose responsibility is this? Well, really, it's everybody's responsibility. We have said many, many times, and others have said it over this conference too, that mental health ministry is not necessarily a new silo, a new wing in your building, a new program, but it's a mindset. So it's really about helping your people assume responsibility for ministry, whether it's just somebody who's a regular attender all the way up to the senior leadership. So anybody can do these kinds of things. We can invite other people to church. When that neighbor is struggling with mental health issues and they could sure use the support of a loving Christian environment, invite them to your church. We've mentioned a couple times about, like the casserole brigade and the hospitality type ministries. Well, hey, if that friend who needs transportation for their children, they might also need a little bit of help getting their house tidied up if they've had a hospitalization. So don't be afraid to step in and just be that kind of friend. Relational respite is something that has been talked about, babysitting somebody's kids, you may not think of it as a respite, but boy, it really can be. When you've got just, overwhelming amount of challenges of your own or with your loved ones in your family, having that mental break to just kind of catch your breath and kind of recalibrate can just be life-giving and life-changing. So maybe your mental health issues are such that it is just really hard for you to step foot out of your house or to step foot into a church. Maybe you're just not confident that you're going to be welcome. Well, hey, discipleship works best one-on-one, no matter what our challenges are. I mean, we've all got issues. So, don't think about just because a person won't come to church that they can't be discipled. You go to them. Every Christ follower has that Great Commission mandate that we go. Parents who are struggling with their kids, when their kids have a lot of challenges, boy, they can really use somebody who's gone before, whether it's a grandparent kind of person, a parent who has children who've had the same experience and are a little farther down the path, or somebody whose kids are grown and, isn't a grandparent in their family, but can kind of, serve that role to help. I mentioned a minute ago the ministry of presence. Just being a listening ear, asking questions, again, that can be life-giving, so somebody feels seen and heard. And then hope coaches. Pastor Brad and the Fresh Hope team, that is a huge part of what they do. And the church offers hope that is not available anywhere else in the world, because we have the eternal hope of life with Jesus and being a part of his kingdom, both here and in eternity. So I would just encourage you, the news and the story, the message of the church is good news. So I encourage you not to be afraid to share it, no matter what the challenges that your friend or family member has.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Catherine shared. One anecdote, and these are people that you'll see at our conference, that one of the volunteers in our prayer area, a woman named Libby Peterson, who used to be the children's ministry director here. One of the things, like when they were in their small group, one of the families in their small group was struggling with a child with schizophrenia. And so Libby just went over to their house one day and it's like, how can I help? And it happened to be picking up a mop that day because, what mom needed to do was to figure out like how to get the house cleaned. And I don't know if she's still here, but interestingly enough, that mom is here volunteering and has been helping to take care of all of us like over the last couple of days. But the other big thing to think about is that, from purely an evangelism and outreach standpoint, everybody knows somebody who's impacted by this, who doesn't know Jesus and doesn't have a connection with a local church. That the best evangelism and outreach, is inviting friends and neighbors. And while, we can, do these, half-day, day-long trainings, which we're delighted to do, especially in Florida in January, February, and March, hand. But the single most effective inclusion strategy is, inviting someone to church and coming alongside them the first few times that they come. Because, having a trusted friend alongside you, it gives you an excuse to not have to interact with any of the excessively cheery greeters that one encounters, heading from the parking lot into church. That, it's a way of, maybe, avoiding situations where you feel scrutinized or uncomfortable situations. That person would know that their friend with agoraphobia is going to feel a lot more comfortable sitting in an end seat, in a back row of the church, near an exit. So a lot of effective and impactful inclusion, or having someone that they know alongside them the first time that they go to a small group. If that's, key or central to a church's, discipleship strategy. So that it's up to the people of the church to recognize the need for this and to recognize the opportunity, and to follow through in the context of their social networks to do the welcoming.
So you can take a picture of this. All of the presentations that the Key Ministry team has done on the main stage are available through this QR code. So you want to only be able to see this one, you'll be able to see the other ones as well, but all the resources are there, and we are always happy, whether it's today or after the conference, to have conversation or help talk through your specific situation. Our contact information is on our website too, so I encourage you to take a picture of that.
One of the other resources that we're going to be adding to that page, if we haven't done it already, is our Mental Health Ministry 101 download.
It's there.
So with the help of the folks from Zondervan, we actually wrote a book called Mental Health in the Church, which is, available if you're interested out in the lobby, that goes into this inclusion model in great detail. But the Mental Health Ministry 101 is a free download the church teams can use in terms of working through their inclusion strategy. And so that what we help them to think about is, the 7 barriers that we had talked about before, recognizing how those come into play in different areas of ministry, and then helping them to think through which of these inclusion strategies are applicable in terms of welcoming folks into their area of ministry. And so that there are charts, there's downloads, there's several pages of questions for what you need to think through if you're in children's ministry, versus student ministry, versus, versus adult ministry, versus being involved in worship ministry. And so that, between the Mental Health 101 ministry tool, and the availability of, folks on our team, and this is all free of charge, to come alongside you, to, meet with your team by Zoom, to do whatever we need to do, to give you support for the journey in crafting a mental health ministry strategy. Like, we're honored for the opportunity to come alongside you and to help with that.
Thank you.
Anyway, guys, thanks so much for being a part of our conference. Don't be strangers, and if you're interested or your church's leadership team's interested in developing a strategy, we look forward to hearing from you. So thank you very much.